Thank you again for being part of this experiment, this inquiry that we're doing locally and very non-locally by beaming Dan in. So my name is Elli and I'll be our MC for the evening, and then these are our wonderful panelists who I will allow to introduce themselves in a moment. But before we begin the panel tonight, we wanted to just take a moment. I wanted to read us something from a book called Fragrant Palm Leaves. Some of you may have read this book. It's a beautiful book of Ty's writing, his journals. And the one that I'd like to read from is from December 1962. Youth is a time for seeking truth. Years ago, I wrote in my journal that even if it destroys you, you must hold to the truth. I knew early on that finding truth is not the same as finding happiness. You aspire to see this truth, but once you have seen it, you cannot avoid suffering. Otherwise, you see nothing at all. You are still hostage to arbitrary conventions set up by others. People judge themselves and each other based on the standards that are not their own. In fact, such standards are mere wishful thinking, borrowed from public opinion and common viewpoints. One thing is judged as good and another as bad. One thing virtuous and another evil. One thing true and another false. But when the criteria used to arrive at such judgments are not our own, they are not the truth. Truth cannot be borrowed. It can only be experienced directly. The fruit of exploration, suffering, and the direct encounter between one's own spirit and reality, the reality of the present moment and the reality of 10,000 lifetimes. For each person, it is different, and it is different today than it was yesterday. When we discover something to be true today through our own direct experience, we will see that our previous assumptions were wrong, or at least incomplete. Our new way of looking transcends yesterday's desire, prejudices, narrow-mindedness, and habits.
Good evening. My name is Nadine Burke. I am a pediatrician, and I also have a background in public health. About 15 years ago, I started a pediatric clinic in a very low-income, underserved neighborhood in San Francisco, California. And I found that many of my patients were experiencing the health consequences of trauma and adversity. So I started a center called the Center for Youth Wellness, which was focused on addressing adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And so I was leading that, doing clinical work, multidisciplinary clinical work, research, and also advocacy is what our team at the Center for Youth Wellness has been doing since 2011. And most recently, I've left my role leading the Center for Youth Wellness as well as my pediatric practice, which is much like leaving my first and second child to take on a new challenge. I was just appointed by the governor of California to be the Surgeon General of California. And for those of you who are not familiar with the American health system, the Surgeon General does not do surgery. I received that question earlier, so I wanted to clarify. The Surgeon General is the leader in health policy, and I am California's first Surgeon General, so this is the first time this position has been established in the state. And my work now is really leading across the state of California our health policy, and particularly taking a deep dive into the role of early adversity in shaping the health of Californians and really trying to transform our systems.
Beloved community, dear ones, my name is Jeanne Anselmo. I'm coming from many different families right now. Right now, you might know me as Chan Bao Tu, True Precious Hand. I'm a Dharmacharya in the Plum Village tradition, a teacher. I received lamp transmission in 2011. I was ordained in the Order of Interbeing in 1995. This is my 25th anniversary of coming back to Plum Village. The first time I was here was 1994. So it's coming home again. I'm also about 45 years a nurse who's been working in community health. When I studied at Cornell University, New York Hospital School of Nursing, we studied the science of unitary human beings, which was an energy-based science of healing human energy, human environment energy exchange. And we were basing it in quantum physics with dialogues with David Bohm and Fritjof Capra and so on. But the focus for us as practitioners was to focus on wellness and well-being for society, and to be creative and expand the role of the nurse, and to practice self-care. So I've been doing that since I've been 24 years old. From there, I got involved at about 25 in applied psychophysiology and biofeedback. And I'm a senior fellow in applied psychophysiology and biofeedback. To be able to actually get any kind of certification, especially at that time, one had to know how to self-regulate and practice. So one had to know how to be able to work with transforming what was happening in one's body. I've been studying and working with, thank you. I've been studying and working with a variety of communities, and working in, similarly to what Nadine has been doing in community health. But then I got called into working with a social justice law school in 2001. And I've been there for 20 years, and have been working with sharing the kind of self-care practices that I've learned from Thai and that I've learned in my other streams of my life, to be able to help to transform the suffering that they're going through as they're working in the blue flame, what Thai calls the hottest part of society. And I'm very grateful to be here with everyone.
Thank you. Hola, and what do you say? Do you say bonsoir or bon nuit? Bonsoir. Bonsoir, buenas noches, and good evening. It's an honor to be here with you. The highlight reel that Elli is asking we each give, I would just say, I'm here as a person, like probably many of us in the auditorium, very concerned about our human family and our living nature family on Earth. And I'm hoping that our conversation tonight can be of benefit to understand the direction that humanity has brought to Earth, and using every different kind of skill and knowledge and approach that each of us have in this auditorium, find a way to have what some people call pervasive leadership, to each of us as individuals to work collectively to understand and then change what these things are. And there's a lot to say about it as it overlaps with what all three of our other panelists have said about connecting science, clinical practice, personhood, and meditation with an understanding of what the wisdom of awareness tells us about the reality of interconnection. And so that's what I'll try to talk about.
So perhaps we can just invite a sound of the bell, come home to ourselves for a moment, and then we'll take the time to hear a little bit more from each of our panelists.
Good evening again. So I have the good fortune of going first, and I want to start by asking the question of how many people here are familiar with the research about adverse childhood experiences? Okay. So a fair number, but many who have not. So I'll start by grounding in saying that my background is that when I finished my pediatrics training at Stanford, and I opened this clinic in a very underserved community, what I was seeing was that many of my patients were being sent to me by teachers or by counselors or people who were leading after-school programs, and they would say, you know, this child has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. And they said, you know, will you see him? And I would say, oh, please send him to me. And when I saw the patient, most often what would happen is when I did what I was trained to do, which is to do a history and to do a physical exam. In the history part, I would hear about kids who were experiencing really challenging things in their homes and in their environments. Parents who were mentally ill or experiencing substance dependence, or kids who were witnessing violence at home, or who themselves had been experiencing violence. And because I'm a deep lover of science. I really love science. When you read the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it lists all the symptoms that my patients were having, but on the bottom, that last line, it said, and these symptoms are not caused by any other mental health disorder. I'm not a mental health practitioner, I'm a pediatrician, right? So I don't know, but I asked myself, what I did notice was there was a pattern that my patients who had the highest dose of adversity also had the greatest levels of symptomatology. And it wasn't just their behavior, It was also things like other health conditions. So, for example, I was treating a young girl for asthma, and I asked her mom about all of her asthma triggers, what her potential asthma triggers could be, because we had been working on removing all of her triggers. And I asked her mom, what is it that we haven't thought of yet? And her mom said to me, well, you know, doctora, my daughter's asthma tends to act up every time her dad punches a hole in the wall. And so, as I immersed myself in the research about how early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children, I came across this study that was done by the United States Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and Kaiser, one of the biggest healthcare organizations in the United States. And when they did a study looking at 17,500 adults, and they asked them about 10 categories of adverse childhood experiences: physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, or growing up in a household where a parent was mentally ill, substance dependent, incarcerated, where there was parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. What they found were two things that I think were really surprising to the medical community. One is that these things were much more common than we had previously acknowledged, right? And it's like we recognize here that suffering is universal. I think that when we look at each of these things, I think many people thought that it only happened in certain places or in certain households, and this research found that 2/3 of people had experienced at least one of these 10 things, and that one in 8 people had experienced 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. The second thing that they found was that the more of these adverse childhood experiences a person had experienced, the greater their risk for not just the things that we intuitively recognize, things like mental health disorders or substance dependence, right? But also the greater the risk for heart disease, stroke, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's disease, right? And so I dedicated my career to understanding why that happens, and what we now understand is that these experiences of adversity, especially during the critical time of childhood, when there's a high degree of plasticity, right, where the environment shapes not only the way the brain develops, but also, interestingly, the way the immune system develops, the way our hormonal systems develop, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. And these changes are together now known as the toxic stress response. And so when I understood, okay, there's an overactivity of the stress response, and that leads to changes in all of these other bodily systems, then for me the thought was, okay, so how do we regulate the stress response? How do we calm these stress hormones and that activity? And I started looking into research about how to do that, and that's really what led me to the research on meditation and mindfulness. And as a pediatrician, I began incorporating it into my clinical practice. What was interesting about incorporating it into my clinical practice is that when I started my center, the Center for Youth Wellness, one of the things that we did early on was we were able to get a grant to train our entire staff on mindfulness and meditation for our entire staff. And it was funny because I had read the research about it and I had decided to use it as a treatment modality for my patients. But it was when we did this training for our own staff was when I began to develop a regular practice. And I found it to be critically important for me for a couple different reasons. One is because this work is hard work. And going into an exam room and working with a family where I'm dealing with a small child who has experienced terrible adversity can be really challenging. But this, I think an additional piece is that for me, the insight about the overactive stress response and how it was affecting the health of my patients, it really came to me in clinic one day. I was caring for a 3-year-old and a 4-year-old. And I was seeing them for their initial physical because they were being placed in foster care. And the reason they had been placed in foster care was because their mom had untreated mental illness and drove her car into a building with her 2 children in the back seat. Their mom had paranoid schizophrenia. And as I looked at those 2 kids, I thought about my own experience with my own mom who had paranoid schizophrenia. And when I imagined what that must have been like for them, how their hearts must have been pounding, how they must have been so terrified, and what might have been happening in their bodies as a result. For me, the interest and the insight about how adversity and trauma affects children came from my own experience. And I think one of the things that the research tells us, right, is that the greater your history of adversity, the more sensitized your system is likely to be to subsequent stressors. So it was really important to me to be able to strengthen and fortify my system with healing practices, to recognize that if I was going to be doing this work every day, that I needed to increase my dose of support and buffering and care and self-care to be able to stay in this work and be available to my patients and my families for a really long time. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about this work is that as we were talking earlier, we were mentioning that our suffering, the idea of transformation of suffering is really resonant to me because I believe very much that our suffering is also the source of our superpowers. I don't think I would have had that insight about what was happening in my patients' bodies if I had not had that personal experience to be able to ask further questions about whether it was affecting their health. And so one of the things that's interesting for me is that I started my clinical practice, and then I started the center, and our team has done and continues to do excellent work. But one of the things that I was finding was that I would talk to other doctors, I would give grand rounds, I would talk about adverse childhood experiences and how we need to move from diagnosing the late stage symptomatology to doing screening, early detection, and early intervention, right? So we can move from, we can do what we do everywhere else in medicine, right? Instead of trying to treat stage 4, right? Doing this early identification so we can identify and treat when it's stage 1 or hopefully stage 0. So we get much better treatment outcomes. And as I was talking to other doctors, I realized that many people hadn't heard about this research. And so in 2014, I recorded a TED Talk. And my dream was, our dream of our team was for 1 million people to see this TED Talk, right? I figured if 1 million people see this TED Talk, boy, that's going to change the conversation. And one of the things that's been amazing for me in my life is that, let's see, the TED Talk was released in 2015, and a little over 5 million people have seen the TED Talk. And for me, that really demonstrated truly we have the ability to change the world, right? Truly we have the ability to change the world. And I think that's something that is very resonant to me also about this practice, is this recognition that we change the world from where we are. In doing our little piece, we start with ourselves and those around us. And what's been fascinating for me in this experience is that obviously before I got up and did the TED Talk, I was terrified. You know, my knees were knocking. But being able to center myself and transform my own experiences and my own experience of suffering into a level of fearlessness about trying to alleviate the suffering of others, right? So I may try and fail, but to fail in pursuit of alleviating the suffering of others, for me, is worth doing. And so now, in my new role as Surgeon General of California, I've been very deep in my focus on addressing adverse childhood experiences and toxic stress. And what's exciting for me is that California now is requiring, beginning January of 2020, that all individuals who are on public insurance be screened for adverse childhood experiences. And in my role, I'm starting out by convening teams of people to understand how do we do this routine screening and implement trauma-informed care across the state. And I know that I'm going to face criticism. I know people are going to ask me, why am I not doing more on one issue or another issue? Why am I not doing more on the opioid crisis or suicide or heart disease? And for those people, I say, this is all of those things. This is the opioid crisis. This is suicide. This is heart disease. All of this is getting to the root of the root, which feels really powerful. And so I feel like I take such a deep joy in this work because, one of the things that I say to people is that social determinants of health, and specifically toxic stress and childhood adversity, is to the 21st century what infectious disease was to the 20th century. And that gives a sense of how far we have to go with the work, but also what the opportunity is that lays ahead of us, where we can get to, if we think about the type of transformation. And I'll say the last thing that I'll say, which is something that's just really fun. I think the joy in this work for me comes in the opportunity to alleviate suffering. And when I first started doing this work, people would say to me, how do you think you're ever going to solve this? You're crazy. If 2/3 of Americans have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, how are you ever going to solve it? And for me, I'm a deep believer in turning a weakness into a strength. So I had a realization, if 2/3 of people have experienced this, that means every single one of us has a loved one, knows someone, has experienced this intimately and personally. And this is something that we are all have a personal stake in solving. And that's so rare when it comes to health issues, right? And so I feel like that same energy of harnessing the energy and the experience of the collective, I believe very deeply that we're going to transform the way that our world responds to this issue.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to join with you. Dr. Nadine Burke Harris and I have met a couple of times before, and Dr. Burke Harris, congratulations on your new position, and thank you for all your inspiration for not only our state of California, which we're so proud of you, but also for the whole world, for really letting people take time to reflect on, how what we offer children is extremely important and has lifelong effects. So that's a beautiful, beautiful offering. So thank you. I know that this panel, if I'm understanding it right, Elli, is about thinking for all of you who are there, and I wish I could have been there. There's lots of reasons logistically why I'm not there, but I'm there in spirit, and I was almost there in body too, but things, we're not going to let that happen. So anyway, so I'm there with you in spirit, and so to think for, I know, how many of you in the audience have a clinical practice where you take care of people directly in clinical settings of all sorts? Please raise your hand. I can see at least half the room. Raise your hand really high. So that looks like, what would you say? That's like about a 2/3 or something? I can't hear you, but so it looks like quite a lot. And all right, and of those of you who are clinicians, how many of you have a regular reflective practice of some sort? Some might call it a mindfulness practice or meditation practice of the clinicians. Let's just see. So that looks like far fewer, okay? And then of the non-clinicians, how many of you are here as scientists? Or a scientist and a clinician. How many scientists do we have in the room? So we can see, raise your hand really, really high. So what does that look like? About maybe 10% or something? 5%? Right? Someone give me a number, I don't... okay, but you can see around there. And how many of you who are scientists are also meditators of some sort? So let's see. So it looks like quite a few, at least from the blurry view I have. And then how many are not clinicians, not scientists, but here at Plum Village with your reflective practice as a monastic or a non-ordained or not someone in the community, but a meditator? Raise your hand so we can see. Okay, so we can ask, what do all of us share in common? And this is, I guess, what I would like to address, but let me just check in with our translators. Is this speed okay? Yeah, I can't hear anyone, so someone give me a thumbs up. Okay, great. So it's a very exciting topic to ask how the wisdom from meditation, so contemplative wisdom, clinical practice, and the science of whatever, the science of adverse experiences, the science of, the brain, the science of relationships, the science of the body, just science in general. And let's try to look at what these three share in common. And, my own practice, to just give you 30 seconds of that, is, I'm trained like Dr. Burke Harris as a physician. I started also like Dr. Burke Harris in pediatrics, but I switched to psychiatry and then child and adolescent psychiatry, and then I became a researcher in parent-child relationships in a field called attachment research. And then after leaving academics, I work in a field where we combine all the different disciplines of science into one framework, and that's called interpersonal neurobiology. And we ask some of these questions like, what is the mind? Or how does the mind connect to relationships and the brain, things like that. So, there's a deep overlap that Elli and I work together, have found between the Plum Village community, Thich Nhat Hanh's community, and interpersonal neurobiology. There's an incredible resonance of those two ways of living and ways of understanding that would be another opportunity to maybe do another video thing or something. But there's a deep overlap. So what the first place to start with is these three areas have in common is you're invited to embrace uncertainty in the exploration of the nature of reality. So embracing uncertainty in the exploration of the nature of reality. Now, For a scientist, of course, that's what you do. You say, I want to ask a question like, why does the way a parent feed a child affect the lengths of the caps on their chromosomes? And, we could study that. Or why, as Dr. Burke Harris has told us, do adverse experiences that aren't where a child is being physically struck, but relationally injured, why does a relationship affect the physiological mechanisms leading to health or unhealth? So a scientist can ask that question with a lot of uncertainty and then want to explore the nature of reality. Then a clinician also, although we're taught all sorts of diagnostic categories, we want to let those categories go and really try to be with the person we're working with. And our next speaker too, and I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to say your name from the community, which I can't pronounce, or the other name, but I'll try both. So next we'll hear from Jeanne Anselmo Chan Bao Thu, if I said that right, and who's also a nurse in a clinical practice, but also works in contemplative practice and a background in science as well. So we have this great opportunity to say, well, how does that uncertainty you embrace as a clinician in a humble way allow you to really be with the nature of reality of a person you're working with? And then in meditation, in meditation, you have this really interesting spot, which I should just say the context. I just spent a week with the Mind and Life Summer Research Institute at the Garrison Institute in New York, where 150 of us were spending a week asking these kinds of questions and how you would scientifically study contemplative insights. Are you hearing me still okay? Yes, okay, great. So there's a lot to say about this, that the uncertainty of contemplation is not just, I don't know, I want to know more, but there becomes an opportunity to explore the very nature of consciousness itself. And so you could ask the question, why would a mindfulness practice be of interest to Dr. Burke Harris, and why would she find it helpful? Or why would meditation be a part of what's being done at Plum Village? Or why has Buddhism lasted for 2,600 years? Or what's the difference between Zen practice and Theravadan practice or Tibetan practice, which was a very huge discussion during our week this last week. That is the academic field studying the mind. It also does not have a definition of the mind. And it turns out that for the most part there are descriptions, but no definitions. So people in the field of philosophy of mind, for example, say that one should never define what the mind is, because just like when you put a circle around something, you've made that thing not what it is. Once you put words to something, you're actually limiting yourself. So in philosophy of mind, the rule is you don't say what it is the mind is, you just try to describe it. So I guess what I want to say in these, I'm watching my time right, this next 10 minutes, what I guess what I want to say is, I think it's possible to embrace uncertainty while at the same time recognize that words can be extremely helpful. So like when you sing a song in Plum Village, the song has words. You don't just have to sit in silence forever. You can actually speak, and speak skillfully. Same thing is true clinically. You know, you could say, well, words are a problem, so just don't speak to your patients. You know, well, actually, it's good to talk to your patients. And in my field, attachment research, you know, parents who talk to their children in specific kinds of ways have children who do much, much better than parents who don't talk to their children. So words actually, while they're limiting, they're also liberating. I mean, so we want to recognize their limitations, but also their power. So the words I'm going to say now may get the community upset. I don't know. I've said these words at a Zen center in the United States, and it made some of the monastics strike against what I said, which I thought was very interesting. So this may happen here in Plum Village. I don't know. This is my first time speaking directly to the larger community. But here's what I'll say. I feel that if you, from a scientific point of view, look at the power of contemplative practice to illuminate the nature of reality and how it impacts clinical practice, the way you tie all of that together, or even ask the question, you know, why, in terms of adverse childhood experiences, why would the relationship between a parent, let's say a mother, but it could be a father or other caregiver, why is the relationship between people I don't know if it's really good. Yeah, why is the relationship between people influencing the physical structure of the body? How does that happen? So the first idea is that there's one reality, that is the world of the physical and the world of the relationships are one reality. So I want to ask you, what do they share in common? Now, this is a very important question, and it's a very difficult question. And Elli can tell you, because she was with 16 interns helping me revise a book that tries to address this singular question from 20 years ago. And one thing you can say, and this is the part that may get people upset, is what the physical body and mental experience like consciousness share in common is something that we study in science that's simply called energy. And Jeanne Anselmo mentioned earlier that she was meeting with David Bohm, who is one of the experts in quantum physics who studies energy. And what David Bohm said to John, what is his last name? John, it'll come to me in a moment. The person who's the head of what's called process theology at Claremont College, and he's 95 now. He was talking about going for a walk with David Bohm, and David Bohm said to him that the one reality that we have has two realms in it. So we have one reality, but Sir Isaac Newton studied one aspect of that reality, which was the reality of large objects. And when you're in the large object world, like the body, things act like entities. They're like, in language terms, they're nouns. And so David Bohm says to this fellow, in this large macro state world, you have entities that are seemingly separate from each other. But when you get to this other realm, this smaller realm of pure energy, like electrons and photons, then there are no entities. There are no nouns, there are just events, there are unfoldings, and that everything is interconnected. Not everything, but things are deeply interconnected. And so when you talk about interbeing, it overlaps directly with one realm of this one reality where things are more like events unfolding, that you can't hold on to anything. All of that being said, and now I'll finish in the next couple of minutes, I think the way we can blend science with clinical practice, with contemplative wisdom, is by taking a stance and making a proposal for what the mind is. Because the mind is what's shared in common between science and clinical practice, between clinical practice and mindfulness practice, and all three of them can find insights that come from defining the mind in the following way. That energy is what happens in a relationship. So adverse childhood experiences are a certain pattern of energy that is what we say is not integrated. It's massive amounts of either neglect, which is a shutting down and excessive what's called differentiation, or massive amounts of linkage, which happens, for example, with sexual abuse. And all of those adverse childhood experiences can be seen as impaired relational integration. Then what's quite striking, and the interns, we as a group tried to find anything that went against this, but the impact of adverse childhood experiences, which are all examples of impaired relational integration, how there's not a balancing of differentiating and linking energy flow between two people, in this case a baby or a child and a parent, it leads to impaired integration inside the body. And integration, for example, inside the brain, looks like it's the basis of health. So you can say, well, that's really interesting. From a scientific point of view, integration may be what health is. And then if you look into the different mindfulness practices and compassion-based practices, or look at the whole notion of interbeing, or what I've heard about, not just from Elli, but from other members of your community, about the nature of what Thai has been trying to teach all these years, my reading of Thai's work, even though he doesn't use these scientific concepts, is that they're really inspiring the community to live a life of integration. That deep contemplative practice is a way of integrating consciousness. And deep contemplative community is integrating relationships. And they are not separate. What happens in consciousness and what happens in community are just manifestations of the same thing. They're manifestations of energy patterns, whether they're happening within or between. And in this way, if you look at practices that differentiate aspects of consciousness, for example, and then link them, you can understand focused attention training, or open awareness training, or compassion training, the three pillars of foundational contemplative meditation. And you can see how they produce more integration. So that's what I think would be really wonderful to talk with as a collective discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dan. We're going to hear a sound of the bell and allow some of what we just heard to integrate. I see some flowers being offered to you. I don't know if you can see us, but this is how we clap here. So we can practice some integration through the bell. So I'm going to invite Jeanne to join us. Dan, I don't know how well you could see the audience, but I just want to share with you that when you cut out, I could really tell how much the energy in this room was with you, because everyone leaned forward. It was like Sister Langham this morning shared how you feel when the TV show stops on a cliffhanger. So our Manus wanted more. We were on board. So thank you. If you couldn't feel our energy, we were very much flowing with you. So I'm going to pass the mic down now to Jeanne.
Wow, right? Isn't this amazing? You know, what I can tell you is I'm never really comfortable sitting like this. I'm more comfortable sitting in a circle and being able to see each other's faces. There, I know, I did the same thing, and Dan as well. Because that's how we sit when we sit in Sangha. And it's also how, when I'm teaching, or whether in a school, a law school, a hospital, we're always in a circle. So it's awkward for me to be in this position. And at the same time, it's overwhelming in a beautiful way. I feel like, even before I met her, I listened to your TED Talk, and I told you, I felt like she's my sister. You know, the work that you're doing and the way that you're doing it, and Dr. Siegel, I'm calling you Dan, but you're over there in Ireland, you know, so I'm going to be visiting my family there on the way home. So anyway, I'm really touched by the way that you're each holding this. Because as a practitioner and as a clinician, I've been working with, I guess, what Thai would call applied practice. So those of us who are clinicians, those of us who are scientists or researchers, Thai is inviting us to always come from a place of practice. And 7 years ago, when he did the science and when Thai offered the Science and the Buddha retreat and talked about quantum physics, he invited researchers to come from the place of practice, contemplative practice, to practice no self, to practice being with uncertainty, to be able to be with uncertainty the way that Dr. Siegel is talking about it. If we don't have that foundation within us, it's very easy to come from notions that we have. I'm a nurse. I see nursing as a spiritual path. I know at different times since I've known Thai, the monastics have asked me to become a nun. But I see my work as a nurse as a spiritual practice. It offers me a way to be engaged in the world and to be called into the places that are calling me. And from that place, I've been dropped into circumstances I would never have gotten into otherwise. It's a strange experience right now, because the experience is of all of these worlds coming together for me. My history is flowing into one. All of these worlds that we would normally have as separate, where what we do in the healthcare system, what we do in the university, what we do here in the monastery, in some way would be connected, but never explicitly as clearly as we're doing now. So as Nadine was sharing, I want to share a little something about the importance of our own practice. And I shared with you how from the time I was in my 20s, I was doing self-care practices, I was doing self-regulation practices as well. I studied Qigong, I studied Tai Chi, I studied with indigenous teachers, I studied therapeutic touch, because the kind of populations I was working with, we didn't have any money. We were working in marginalized, underserved, underprivileged communities, and so we offered at that time what was called alternative or holistic practice, because it was free. We were the therapeutic presence. I offered mindfulness, I offered biofeedback with small little thermometers. Seaburn knows what I'm talking about. So practicing, say, self-regulation or relaxation, imagine doing relaxation with people 5 times a day. Deep relaxation, teaching people, helping them to begin to become aware of themselves in some way. As Dr. Siegel was talking about, that presence, that relationship, that therapeutic relationship, that healing bond, was something I really was actively and consciously cultivating, not only for myself, but for the community I served and for the people I was serving. So I was working with people with cancer and AIDS. I was working with people with life-challenging illnesses. And about 1989, a dear friend of mine who was a peace activist got killed. She was murdered very violently. I could walk into places in the community. I could walk with people who had gone through enormous amount of suffering, but that threw me into a place that I hadn't known before. It was off my inner map. I think I probably began to shut down, but nobody would have known it, because I was pretty high functioning. I knew something felt dead inside of me. And having been working with social justice advocates and also helping professionals who work in very challenging healthcare scenarios, they also talk about at times getting numb. I didn't know what to do with that. And then one day, this was 1989, so there was no internet, a little newsletter came to my door, and in it was an article about this Buddhist monk who was coming back to the United States to help heal the veterans who had bombed his own country. I was like, wow, how is it possible that he's able to come and work with the veterans that, in a sense, killed his people? And I have one friend who died, and I'm struggling. So I was aware of that, aware of him. I didn't pay much attention after that. I just noted it. I also liked the fact that he was in an area where they were growing sunflowers. That was big. A year later, another newsletter came to my door that I didn't order or anything, and it had in it a calendar of retreats, including one in Mount Madonna in Watsonville, California in 1991 by this monk. So it was my 39th birthday. I decided, hey, what the heck? And it was for helping professionals. It's very helpful, right? Doesn't that always get us here? Right? Say it's for helping professionals, say it has to do something with our job, we're there. Just for ourselves, right? It's like pulling teeth, right? So there I was. And I want to say a couple of things about this because it was amazing for me. I was going there because I was trying to transform the suffering of Susie's death, my friend Susie. When I got there, it was like a who's who. I walked in, there were, I won't go through all the names, but anybody who was there, it was overwhelming. There were 450 of us. Every time I turned around, there was somebody that was of note. I was there to cook my potato. That was how Ty would talk about it. It was important for me to focus on cooking my potato. It didn't matter who was in the room. I needed to be there to transform what was happening. There's some other great stories about that particular retreat. But what I can tell you is that the last part of the retreat, Ty always talks about no birth, no death. He would burn a piece of paper and talk about the elements that happened. And then after that, there would be 3 bells, and then people would get up and bow. I still was sitting there. I wasn't done. I didn't move. People are getting up, they're moving around. We were silent for 5 days. Completely silent, because we were also in a yoga center that the teacher didn't speak. People were starting to speak after 5 days. I didn't move. I stayed there. I said, I'm not going to move. And with that, in some moment, with all the milling around, I could feel a connection again. I could feel a connection to my friend. I could feel a connection to myself. And that is what I carry. All the other teachings I had gone through, everything I had experienced, couldn't help me in that moment. Whatever it was in this beloved community that we have here in Ty's practice and his teachings, whatever map he knows, having walked in the blue flame, the hottest part of the flame, knowing how to do that, and having the ancestors who have done that, and all of the Youth for Social Service, all of the people in the Order of Interbeing, all of them in some way helped to hold me in a circumstance I had no awareness of. What I'm trying to do now, I'm being dropped into scenarios. My own Sangha was impacted by Hurricane Sandy. Over 10 people lost their homes. We were still in devastation for over a year and a half after the storm. I helped former Brother Bear with a veterans retreat at Blue Cliff Monastery, working with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. Some of them were carrying guns. They were ready to commit complete suicide. We're in a scenario, Dr. Siegel talked about this. We're in a world where there's enormous amount of upheaval and violence. And there's a lot of fear. But there's also enormous amount of beauty and peace and healing. And the ability, as Nadine was talking about it, to hold both. That's what Ty is talking about, to be able to hold both. The height of our joy and the depths of our sorrow. To be able to have the mud and the lotus is what this tradition offers us. That is what I'm hoping we as clinicians and we as researchers begin to explore. What is it about this funny little tradition that we have with all of these beloved beings, these monastics that are cultivating this kind of kind spirit? There is a transmission that happens. I know in the law school, where I'm just going to end on this, where I am, I've been there for 20 years. I got there, we started the program September 10th, 2001, the day before September 11th. These were young people who had come from marginalized communities, underprivileged communities, under-resourced communities, under-sourced communities, that were going back after getting their degree to serve the communities from which they came from. Some of them were refugees, some of them were homeless. I knew at the time when 9/11 happened that in some way I was being invited in, because logically, what is a nurse doing in a law school in 2001? It didn't make sense. And so I offered the compassion and the love and walking in not knowing, walking in uncertainty, calling on the ancestors in a sense, to help to show me the way. We went from, and this social justice law schools focus on rage and anger, at least in the 90s and early 2000s, as a way of generating the energy to transform society. I wasn't coming from that. In 2006, the students turned to me and said, "Will you teach us law based in love?" In 2007, Blue Cliff Monastery opened, and I, following the mindfulness trainings, was not going to influence where the students were going. They decided on their own, amongst a number of options, that they wanted to go to Blue Cliff for an annual retreat. The monks and nuns, when they met them, said, "Hey, these guys are like us. They're law monks. They're committed to transforming suffering. They have a dedicated practice." So they called them law monks. Before I came, a couple of them sat with me at my kitchen counter and said, "You represent us well. We are now in the process," this is them talking, "of creating an institute of contemplative practice at our law school. We want it to be a caring culture, a culture of caring. We want to offer healing for all people. We want to be able to hold the suffering of anyone, no matter what they've done. We want to embody it, and we want to live it." I'm humbled. I am humbled because I know that this is the work of many hands, of that interbeing awareness. What I have now, we are calling in the law school therapeutic presence. And what I used to say to some of the physicians or nurses or psychologists or psychiatrists or lawyers, to get them to be inspired to do this inner contemplative practice, that it was cultivating your inner credentials. People know when you have inner credentials. They can feel it. They know when you're walking your talk. So whether you're a researcher, whether you're a clinician, whether you're a lawyer, whoever you are, a family member, a student, we all need inner credentials. And what my hope is that out of beginning to understand how we can cultivate a beloved community, we can then be able to not only have trauma-informed practice, but well-being-informed practice. Beloved community cultivation. Thank you.
Jeanne, thank you for your sharing. Speaking with both of you today and hearing Dan reminds me of this question I've been asking myself as a grad student. How can I research mindfulness but mindfully research? When I started my PhD, people told me it's very isolating and lonely and will be really hard and sad. And I thought, oh, no thank you. I'll do it via Sangha, and that's been supporting me. We have a little more time, and listening to each of you share, I wanted to perhaps pose a question that you might be in dialogue about or each share with us. Is Dan still with us? But a red thread that kind of ran through, I think, since this afternoon and into our conversation now was this idea of holding both. Dan talked about two realms, this Newtonian realm of large objects where I'm sitting here and you're sitting there, and that is a reality I live in. And also this quantum realm where we have no separation in our practice. Maybe we would talk about the historic dimension. We are all in this room, and the ultimate dimension that we are also have no self. And so this balance Dan proposed, that there's some kind of integration as the basis of health. When we spoke earlier, Nadine, you shared a little bit about, wanting to do so much in the world and also knowing that we can't do everything all the time. And so perhaps what I want to ask each of you, maybe from your own lived experience, how do you balance and integrate both everything you want to do in the world with the reality of your Newtonian body, of your limitations? How do you swim between those two realms in your work or in your personal life? For those of us that are very inspired to go out and do this work, what does that balance look like? Also, you've brought up, what we're facing as a human family, and also what we face as individual families. So I'm just interested in any insights the three of you might want to share on holding both.
I think for myself that that holding that balance has been somewhat of a great relief because when I first started in this work, I thought, okay, as a clinician, I'm going to try and find the answer for my patients. And then I realized I couldn't do that. And then I said, okay, I'm going to start a center, and I'm going to get all these other clinicians, and together we're going to find the answer for my patients. And then, I had the realization of oh wow, the whole world has to change, and that makes it. It's actually such a relief, right? Because it gives a sense that it isn't. It's not all sitting on my shoulders, right? I think I have an opportunity to do what I can from where I am, and so a big part of the response for me is to inform others, to inspire them, and to encourage them. And the piece of it that I think is really important, and that I would say to you, especially as a grad student, is that when we look at the added dimension of time, right, and look at, as the thing I mentioned earlier, we'll get more done if we go at 80% for 20 years than if we go at 95% for 2 years. And so for me, it's really important, for me, my mindfulness practice, my time with my family, my weeks like this one where I wasn't sure how it was going to go with the governor, with me taking a week off to be in France at a mindfulness and neuroscience retreat. But it was really critically important because that's our sustainability and our long-term practice is so critical. That's how we change the world, right? By being in it for the long haul. So that's what it feels like for me. So holding both, for me, it's the integration. It feels like it makes it, there's not an option of me trying to do it all right now. which gives me permission to say, okay.
Thank you. I find that where I'm at now in terms of self-care and balance is understanding more about deepening beloved community and sisterhood and brotherhood, to really, really cultivate relationships. And I use the monastic model in what I'm doing in the law school and also in my local Sangha. And because I think that this is a wonderful experiment and that Plum Village has been doing, and they have years of background with it. So we've been trying to adapt it into our lay communities and into hospitals and into mainly that right now with the law school and the local Sangha. I think that for me, if I'm living not as a separate self, my health and well-being isn't a separate experience, even if I'm taking care of myself well. And using terminology from biofeedback and applied psychophysiology, I'm an N of 1, okay? So all of my inner research is an N of 1. But in interbeing awareness, that doesn't apply. I'm in a community of practice, and that's what I feel is really going to be sustainable going forward in life as it is, with the challenges that are there. And the more that I can be able to bring in and support other people within the community, they are supporting me. My sister is here from my Sangha. We've traveled together as second bodies, and these are practices that are very important to do. They help to sustain us so that when the GPS was programmed at the airport for Tanakh, excepting they programmed it for Tanakh outside of Cognac, and it took me 6 hours to get here after traveling 24 at night. Happiness. Yes, I did pull over, and I almost started sobbing, but I took breaths and rested for a while. My sister got back in the car, and then off we went, and we got here. These things are going to happen. So I know that I can't do it alone. We are so conditioned in our society to do things alone. We as independent thinkers, as practitioners, independent practice, think about that. Whether you're in law, whether you're in science, whether you're in as a clinician, we need to have more of a collective support. So I'm inviting you to turn to Plum Village monastics and see if something inspires you. I don't know. This is my experiment now, and I'm looking forward to hearing what other people are doing.
Thank you both, and Dan, I'll hand it over to you in a moment to weigh in and have our final word. And I just wanted to share, as a qualitative trained researcher, an N of 1. One person is enough of a sample size, because we would say, although it's only one sample, there's an unlimited number of data points from someone's lived experience. And so your first person subjective experience, we would say, is enough for a significant finding. So Dan, I'll pass it to you to weigh in on this conversation, and then we'll gently bring our evening to a close here.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me okay? Good, thank you. Well, just to start with, it's Jeanne or Jeannie? Jeanne. So what Jeanne was saying is so, important about community, and, we are so conditioned to not only do things on our own, but to even think that the self, that four-letter word, is defined by these bodies we're born into, is a huge filter of consciousness that in a way is not only limiting our understanding personally about how to live a life in contemporary culture, but and that's a whole thing we can get into, but that idea that you're bringing up of doing things with beauty is so crucial. And then Nadine, you beautifully, talked about your own experience with your mom, and I think that's really both courageous of you and inspirational, so that we know that you live a life as a professional, and you can't separate the personal from the professional. Of course, you have to do it with very clear boundaries in all of our work, but you as a person need to know, what is my professional work, what is my personal history, what do I come at in this differentiated way, and making sense like that is so important. So the few things I guess I would say, they relate to two items, Elli, to respond to your question. You talk about the N of one. I'll just tell you a quick story. At the Mind and Life meeting, there was a wonderful researcher, a young student, a graduate student named Juan. So he got up in front of everyone and said, "I have an N of Juan." That's what it reminds me of. But yes, we're an N of one. So the first thing I want to say is about swimming. When you get into a pond or into a pool or in the ocean and you're doing the breaststroke, sometimes your head is above the water and you're getting a breath of air, and sometimes you're underwater. And there are literally, in this world we live in, a water realm and an air realm, and you never hear anyone really getting upset. Like, oh my God, there's a water realm and there's an air realm. This is like mind-blowing, But there are two realms and they have very different properties. I asked in one group 3,000 therapists, and about 1% were aware of what physics has demonstrated, that there are two realms of one reality. And then I was with 3,000 techies from Silicon Valley in San Francisco, and it was the same percentage. So 99% of very educated people are not aware of what science has told us. Now, Elli knows because we were just together in Toronto discussing this, but these two realms correspond with the historical and the universal, or the absolute, which there are two groups. One group says what is it? It's
historical and ultimate, yeah.
Say it again. Well, one branch of Buddhism calls it historical, and what's the other one? The ultimate? Yes. And the other calls it the relative and the absolute. Or no, did I just, universal? No, I'm mixing, but it's the same thing. Actually, the same thing. So what's really fascinating about that is you have a 2,600-year-old practice that came up with descriptions of the historical and the absolute, the universal. You know what I mean. But which is in your community? I can't get it straight. It's historical and ultimate. Okay, HU, like the chocolate. U, like human. Okay. Okay, the historical and the ultimate. Now, here's something to just address this first point I just want to make is, for me personally, doing a regular contemplative practice, I happen to do this thing called the wheel of awareness, which just integrates consciousness by differentiating the knowing of consciousness in the hub and then distinguishing it from the knowns of consciousness on the rim, and then systematically linking these differentiated elements with a spoke of attention and then bending that spoke around at one point in the practice right into the hub, so you drop into pure awareness. Anyway, I do this every day. It's my daily routine, whatever. But to answer your question, it's like swimming. So that every day I get a chance to be in the historical realm on the rim and the ultimate realm in the hub. And so it's like swimming. You just learn that to integrate your life, you embrace both. They're differentiated realms that I do believe correspond to the macro state for the historical and the micro state for the ultimate. And that you learn to live that way. And for me personally, facing stressors or reading the newspaper, which is a huge stressor, or facing death, has completely transformed with this experiential immersion and this conceptual understanding. So that's the first thing. The last thing I'll just say is that I believe very deeply that what the Sangha has done, that Thai has inspired, has a collective wisdom that can also inspire all of humanity to wake up to an awareness that the constructed delusion that is collectively shared in contemporary culture of a separate self as being the source of identity or the source of happiness or the source of just existence, it's killing individuals and it's killing the planet. And so when I'm asked to do work with different people in environmental justice, they say, what should we do? We can't inform people, it doesn't work. We can't scare people, it does not work. And they asked me to come, and I said, well then, if informing them doesn't work and scaring them doesn't work, maybe we need to transform them. And so the transformation that we need as a human family is a win-win-win process. It's going to be a win for the individual who has the wisdom of awareness that comes from contemplative practice, and the person I tried to remember was John Cobb. John Cobb had the discussion with David Bohm a long time ago that we can just really honor, that there are these two realms, and that modern culture is trying to convince you that you are a noun that identifies with your body only. Of course you have a body and you should enjoy the body, so that's a me, but you are much more than a me, you're also a we. So you're much more than a noun. You are a noun in part, you have a body, but you're also a verb. So part of what I think we all need to do is figure out how to integrate identity for our family, our human family. Because when we look at another person, let's say, who's not in our immediate family or religious group, or doesn't share the same color of our skin, or doesn't have the same nationality, and we think of them as other, then we are contributing to a delusion that will kill Earth. When we as a human species don't look at the rest of the species of nature and realize they are manifestations of the same essence that is this verb-like thing called our life, then we will kill the planet. So the win for the individual is they can dissolve the delusion of a separate self. The win for human communities is that every single study of human flourishing that looks at happiness, that looks at how long you live, that looks at medical health, and that looks at mental health, every single one of those positive outcomes shows that it's social communities of support, social networks of support. So our networks will be encouraged from a practitioner point of view and also a scientific point of view. This is where we are. And then the third win, so it's individuals will benefit, communities will benefit. Who else is going to benefit? If you look at where we're going on Earth, we have a very short window of time to stop destroying life on Earth. Comparing differences and linking them that you have shown in your Sangha. It can be an inspiration for how, in our community, we don't have the word interbeing, but we make a funny thing up. We say, well, if you're a noun-like individual something in your body, and that's important, that's a me, but you're also a relational something with other people on the planet, and that's a we, how do you honor these different ways of being in the world, but also link them together without losing their essence? So, one way you could do it, of the many, many ways, and we're doing this in different languages, but in English you do it as me plus we equals we, M-W-E. In Spanish, they come up with yo, and nosotros is yosotros. And there are people who speak French there. What would you do in French? I don't speak French. How would you do me plus we equals what?
Je et nous, ça fait genou.
Genou, like genou, something like that. Merci beaucoup. Yeah. So we, literally, we could make a movement on Earth to have every language on this planet come up basically with a way of expressing what's my identity if I embrace the reality of our interconnection, the reality and truth of interbeing. If I embrace that, what would I call myself? I call myself Mui. And what is absolutely amazing is when you teach this in schools to young kids, Nadine, you teach young kids that they don't have to just be in their body, they're also their relationships with other people and the planet, and you name it as Mui. You should see the energy that's released, that the lie of the separate self can finally be identified and let go. Thank you.
Many flowers here. I don't know if you can see them. So Dan, thank you for sharing with us and dropping in while you have a very busy week. For me, something very special about coming home to Plum Village is just to see this dialogue that we have here, to be offered this space to come home to ourselves, and then also to take that out into the world with us. This piece of action that's in our practice. And Thai often will say, the way out is in. In order to take care of others, we must know how to take care of ourselves. And when we take care of ourselves, we already take care of others. And I was reminded of that as each of you answered my question, so thank you.